Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome to the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute's presentation of Grace Aneiza Ali's book, Liminal Spaces, Migration and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora. I'm Ann Morning. I'm the academic director at 19 Washington Square North, which is NYU Abu Dhabi's home in New York. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you our two panelists today. I'm going to start with Professor Onika LaBennett, who will serve as the discussant, the person in conversation with our author. Professor LaBennett is a social anthropologist and an associate professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She is the editor of Racial Formation in the 21st Century, published by the University of California Press in 2012. And she is the author of She's Mad Real, Popular Culture and West Indian Girls in Brooklyn, published by NYU Press in 2011. She's Mad Real is an ethnography of Caribbean adolescent girls in Brooklyn that focuses on their mediations of identity vis-a-vis popular culture. LaBennett, who was born in Guyana and raised in Brooklyn, is now currently working on a new manuscript entitled Global Guyana, Women, Race, and Resources in the Caribbean and Beyond, which traces the entwined histories of Guyanese women of African and Indian descent, and it explores family, ethnicity, and race in Guyana and in its diaspora, as well as popular culture associations between the Caribbean and sexuality. These themes and more, I'm sure, are no doubt part and parcel of her course entitled Women in Hip Hop, which I had to mention because Elle magazine ranked it among the top 10 in a list of college classes that give us hope for the next generation. So not many people can claim that, so I wanted to make sure to mention that. Now, I'm delighted to turn to our author today, Grace Aneiza Ali. Professor Ali is a curator and an assistant professor and provost fellow in the Department of Art and Public Policy at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. She's also an affiliated faculty member with the Asian Pacific American Institute. Professor Ali's curatorial research practice centers on curatorial activism, socially engaged art practices, global contemporary art, and the art of the Caribbean diaspora, with a focus on her homeland of Guyana. She serves as curator at large for the Caribbean Cultural Center's African Diaspora Institute in New York. She is the founder and editorial director of Note magazine, which is an award-winning nonprofit arts journalism initiative that reports on the intersection of art and activism. And her other awards, including being named a Fulbright Scholar, an Andy Warhol Foundation Curatorial Fellow, and a World Economic Forum Global Shaper. Finally, Professor Ali serves as a mentor for Girls Right Now, a leader in arts and writing education for underserved girls in New York City. So with that, I want to extend a very warm welcome to both of our panelists and just say how much we're looking forward to the conversation between the two of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Anne, for that beautiful and generous introduction to both of us, and also for your incredible support and enthusiasm for this book before it was even published. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Anne. That was a wonderful introduction. And so I think I'm going to get us started. I want to, is that right, Grace?
Yes.
So I want to start by thanking Anne for that great introduction again, and thanking NYU Abu Dhabi for this opportunity to be in conversation with Grace Ali about her wonderful book. I want to start by emphasizing that, this book begins with a statement about how the artists and writers in liminal spaces are part of a contemporary movement to disrupt and challenge narratives of the region, specifically Guyana, but of the region more broadly speaking. And as Anne alluded in her introduction, Grace Aneiza Ali has been a leader in that movement for quite some time. So liminal spaces can be seen as the culmination, although that may not be the right word because I know she's going to continue and do so much more, but it's the culmination of years of bringing the art of Guyana to global cities like New York. So from a conversation that she organized at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in 2014 called Visually Speaking, A Worldview from Guyanese Photographers, to a major exhibition that she curated at the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute in 2017 on Guyanese artists. Grace has been leading this movement. She is an innovator and a leading voice. And this book, Liminal Spaces, is an incredible contribution. I want us to really understand the significance of this work because it does so much. It's shining a light on a diasporic group that is often either ignored or marginalized, even though Guyanese represents such significant numbers in global cities like New York and London and Toronto. And among that group, Guyanese women are particularly marginalized, even though they're central players. So that's one of the book's really important contributions. It's shining a light on those groups. It's also speaking to broader questions around citizenship, immigrants and migration, what those experiences are like, how they're constituted, what are the challenges and dialogues that go along with those notions of citizenship, migration. So Grace is also bringing that to the forefront in this volume. The fact that this volume is multimodal is one of the reasons why it's such an important contribution. It's bringing together memoir, poetry, visual art, curatorial essays in this wonderful exhibition on the page. And to do this with 15 women of the Guyanese diaspora spanning generations is really a unique, one-of-a-kind contribution. So I want to also say that those many hats that Grace talks about in the introduction to this book, that of curator, editor, essayist, daughter of Guyana, immigrant herself, she's really placing herself within this text in such an intimate and powerful way and using all of those positionalities to bring these remarkable stories and these remarkable works to a broader audience. And I think in this way for the first time. So I want to make sure that that contribution is understood because it's really such an original book. I know it's already making such a splash in so many different contexts, but it will be in classrooms and in conversations and in discourses about Guyana and about the Caribbean and about these global cities for a very long time to come. So I think that one of the contributions of the book is a great place maybe for us to start before Grace transitions into showing us some of the images from the text. Part 2 of the book focuses on arcs of migration, those who left and those who are left behind. And I know that's one of the things that Grace and I are going to talk about today, because that's a part of the migration story that's often left out. We tend to focus on those who leave, but we tend not to spend so much time talking about those who are left behind. And the book does this so beautifully. So I'll stop there and I'll let you share some images and then we can continue the conversation.
Onika, you went all the way back to 2014.
I had to, yes.
That was incredibly generous and thoughtful. And thank you so much for those words of support, but also throughout, the last few years, I've been such an admirer of your scholarship and the important work that you've been doing to elevate the stories of Guyana, which is truly brilliant, generative, innovative work. And I know we've collaborated on other projects before and exhibitions, and this is just another thing that we can collaborate on. But I just want you to know how much I greatly admire the work that you're doing and your incredible time to first of all, spend time with this project and to be in conversation with me about it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure. It really is.
So what I want to do for our folks watching is just to share a few highlights, not the entire, everyone in the book, but a few highlights of the book, because it really is, I think, such a visual feast throughout all of its chapters. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And as Onika mentioned, I had to wear all of these hats. This was a very personal project, as well as its attempt to be a scholarly project, an artistic project, a literary project. And so I really wanted to shape the book, not only as an editor, but also with a curatorial perspective in mind. And so we brought these 15 women together, a very intergenerational group of women ranging from their 70s to their 20s, and ranging from being literally in Guyana to being in Guyana's diaspora in the United States, in Canada, and in the UK. And so the book is organized in this 4-part journey. And it's tracing the migration path of women from that initial moment of departure to their arrivals, to what it takes to transition and to adapt into these new diasporic soils. And then we end the book with returning to Guyana and what that return reverse migration actually entails. And the first part of the book starts with the section called Mothering Lands. And in it, there are 3 women who are all first-generation daughters. They're first-generation Canadians and Americans, and what they have in common is all of their mothers were born in Guyana. And what they really do in this section is examine how those Guyanese-born mothers serve as a metaphor for their relationship with Guyana. So they can't really separate mothers from Guyana, and they're wrestling with Guyana as this mythical motherland. And so we start the book with Keisha Scarvo's beautiful portraiture series titled Mama's Clothes, and she pays homage to her late mother. And in the portrait, Scarvo is embodying her mother's dresses, these beautiful bright prints, to evoke her connection to Guyana. Erica de Freitas is a Toronto-based artist whose grandmother was a very skilled baker in what was then British Guyana in the 1950s, and would then pass down that skill to Erica's mother and then later Erica. And in this essay, de Freitas is just so beautiful and poignant in expanding on how she uses this craft of icing cakes from her grandmother as an important symbol in her work and in her language. And that part of the book ends with this beautiful back and forth between mother and daughter, Serena and Natalie Hopkinson. One of my favorite parts of working on this project was to see they write letters back and forth to each other, and as an editor, to see how this particular part of the book evolved and grew was such a beautiful experience. And Natalie Hopkinson and Serena Hopkinson have had several migrations across 3 countries, Guyana, Canada, and the United States. And they've gained a lot in those migratory paths, but they also lost a lot. And so they write these beautiful, honest, vulnerable letters to each other, at times revealing things to each other for the first time about what that migration experience was for them. The second part of the book, as Onika mentioned earlier, was a part of the project that was really, really critical for me. And this part called The Ones Who Leave, the Ones Who Are Left. And what I've been talking about for a long time, both personally and in my scholarship, is that there are 2 spectrums of the migration arc, the ones who leave and the ones who are left. That the act of migration is very much an act of reciprocity, and that to leave a place, we have to reconcile that we must leave others behind. And as Onika said, too often we aren't talking about the narratives and the stories and the experiences of the people that are left, because their stories get eclipsed by the ones doing the leaving. And so in my chapter titled The Geography of Separation, I talk about what it means to have left Guyana to almost 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago. And I really try to grapple with the ways that I've entered into people's lives and that I've departed people's lives, and what I got wrong in a lot of those cases, and perhaps own up to that accountability and the responsibility of not being sensitive enough in my own departures and arrivals of the people that I was leaving. Khadija Ben is a very talented photographer based in Georgetown, Guyana, and she has shared these beautiful portraits of our elder Amerindian women whose descendants have long migrated to border countries like Venezuela, Brazil, to the United States and Canada, and even to neighboring islands in the Caribbean. And yet these women make the choice to stay or are forced to stay. Meanwhile, their children, their grandchildren, sometimes even their great-grandchildren have left the country. And these portraits are stunning. Some of these women were born in as old as 1930s in Guyana. And so they've seen Guyana evolve from a British colony to an independent nation, to a post-independent nation. So they're really incredible witnesses to Guyana's history. And a chapter I know has a lot of personal resonance with Amika and her own story, which I hope you'll share later. Ingrid Griffith explores the rupture, migration, and axon families when children are split apart from their parents, and how that separation reverberates years after that first moment of departure. And it's also a narrative we rarely see, and that is what the act of leaving means for a child and how it becomes an open wound of abandonment. And I know that now in our political climate, we're beginning to understand the impact of separating children from their parents as we see what has happened on the American-Mexican borders too. So it's something that I was really intent on making sure that we engaged in this book. Part 3 is called Transitions, and it focuses on how women have to unfold that life in a past land to construct a life in a new land and what that entails. And in these selection of essays in this part, we witness how through migration, Guyanese women are made, they're remade, they're unmade, and then they have to do it, all over again. And this is the work of artist Suchitra Matai, who's also had a fascinating migratory path from Guyana to Canada to the United States. And she uses her work to illustrate the liminal space of disorientation when one has to transition through these multiple cultural spheres. And finally, we end the book with a part called Returns, Reunions, and Rituals. And in these essays, explore the returns to Guyana and the ways in which we remain tethered, physically tethered, psychically tethered to this place and to our family legacies there. This is a beautiful memoir essay by the London-based writer Maria del Pilar Caledine, whose father came to the UK through the Windrush migratory movement. And she writes this essay of returning to Guyana with her father for the first time in 45 years. And in their intertwined story, they really illustrate the fractures and the fissures migration creates in relationships. But in the case of Maria, it also shows her incredible willpower to rebuild not only a bridge between these two lands, but rebuild a bridge between a father and a daughter. So I'll stop sharing there. And those are just some highlights. Again, there are 15 incredibly talented women in this book. And I will put a link in the chat. The book is open access, so anyone can access the PDF and HTML version of the book anytime you wish. So I'll make sure I add that into the chat.
Thank you for that, Grace. And people really should access the book because, as Grace said, there are ways in which this book tells the unique stories of the Guyanese diaspora, but these stories are also relevant, and Guyana is such an important place from which we can kind of look out to broader issues like migration, like family separation. So you talked about this, and I mentioned it in my opening, that centering the stories of those who remain and the relationship between those who leave and those who are left is one of the critical interventions of this book. It's both a really touching acknowledgement of kinship and family and connection, but it's also a valuable contribution to our scholarly understandings of migration, because that arc between who left and who leaves and who's left behind is often not the subject of scholarship. So that would be a great place for us to begin. And you showed the photograph of Ingrid Griffin and her two siblings, her brother and sister, after her mother sent them their Christmas outfits, right? After being separated. And as I mentioned, that image really resonated not only with my own experience, but also with the girls about whom I wrote in my first book, She's Mad Real. That's such a common story of migration from the Caribbean, more broadly speaking, and definitely from Guyana in particular, where parents often left to establish themselves in places like New York to get their papers, their quote unquote papers, and to be able to sponsor their children from back home. In that time period when the parents were in New York, children were often raised by grandmothers, aunts, and that's a really painful period of family separation. It's one in which there are remittances sent home and barrels filled with toys and clothing and all sorts of things. And so the girls in my book talked about that frequently. And it's certainly part of my own personal story. My parents left Guyana when I was a year old. And my brother and I didn't see them again until I was 7.5 and he was 14. And so in all of those years in between, we were raised by my grandmother, and we got clothes just like Ingrid Griffith did from New York. Oftentimes, they were not really appropriate for the seasons in Guyana. So in the photograph, we see the little boy, and those three children are so smartly dressed. We have to remark on that. But the little boy is wearing what appears to be kind of a tweed jacket. The two little girls are wearing the long sleeve dresses. They're completely well thought out outfits. We can see the care that their mother put into thinking about the coordinations of the hats and the shoes, and that they all kind of matched each other and were so fashionable for the time period. So there's love communicated in that photograph as well.
I'm so I'm so glad you shared your own personal story, because in a child's understanding, I don't think you are able to grasp mommy and daddy are leaving to make a better life. All you know is mommy and daddy have left you, right? That's how you interpret that. And I know, I think my mom had been having conversations. We waited about 10 years before all of our paperwork was vetted and approved, until it was a long kind of waiting. But I think she had that option of, could she go ahead first and then, bring her children later? And she chose no. And she chose no because when she was also a young woman, she saw her 6 siblings all leave Guyana one by one by one by one. Her parents had passed away, and she remained the only person left. And I think because she knew that sense of aloneness and maybe a sense of abandonment too, through no one's fault, but still those feelings of abandonment are very real. She didn't want to have her children experience that. When I was growing up, And we should also say, Onika, that for those folks that are not familiar, Guyana has one of the largest out-migration rates. So the Guyana is a very unique and acute experience of migration because, according to the latest data, more people live outside of the country now than live within it. So we have a particularly acute history with folks making an exodus out of the country and moving away. And I remember, 1 year in school, forming really lovely friendships with people, and then the next year they were gone, or mid-semester they were gone. And no one explains to you as a child why your friends are no longer there, why your friends keep leaving every year, and you're just left with this empty hole. Ingrid's chapter on what it feels like to have to interpret that leaving. We also are part of a culture where adults aren't necessarily sitting children down and speaking to them about, the greater issues at play. My family, we call that big people stories. You don't get, you don't get to talk about big people stories, even though they impact you very deeply. And so you're left to grapple with that on your own and in your own interpretations. And I hope that Ingrid's story, I know it's inspiring you, I know it has inspired you, Onika, but I hope that Ingrid's story inspires the host of other people who have been on that angle of the migration story, where as children, you have to make sense of your parents leaving.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Grace. Everything you said is so important. And it's also that it's really difficult for the parents too. Your mother had to make a very difficult decision, as did mine. And I know that separation was really hard on my mother, to be away from her 1-year-old and her 7-year-old when she left Guyana. Was just heart-wrenching. And so this tells the painful stories of separation that so many immigrant families, unfortunately, have experienced. But as you said, there are ways in which it's particularly important in Guyana because so many Guyanese have left and continue to leave.
Were you able to talk about it as a family, even when you got older and you had a little bit mature sense of what had happened? Did you all tackle it and talk about it?
It's, as you mentioned, it's not a very culturally Guyanese thing to do, to have those sorts of conversations. That's a very kind of American, sort of therapeutic approach that we never really talked about. We never sat down and talked about it, but it was interesting for me as I got older to learn about how my mother suffered through that process. I knew about it from my own perspective of feeling left behind, but I didn't know what it meant to her. And she had all of these photographs of herself talking on the phone with us in Guyana. And at the time, we didn't have a phone at my grandmother's house, but my grandmother would take us to Georgetown to call our mother. And my mother would have people take her photograph while she was talking to us on the phone. Such an interesting thing, right? This is before FaceTime and Zoom. That was sort of her way of documenting those conversations, which I found really touching when I learned about them later.
That's so, the documenting the phone calls that's a really, really profound image to even think about.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we within that section on separation and being left behind, you share your story. And, I think that's actually a good place for us to turn next, because I was really interested in the ways in which Keisha Scarvo's Mama's Clothes focused on the objects, right? Clothing as a connection to her mother and a connection to Guyana, as you mentioned, with the images you showed previously. In your story, it's your mother's karahi that is the connection to Guyana and the connection to her mother. And so I thought it was really interesting that there's a thread across the essays in which certain objects come to embody that kind of maternal connection, the connection to the motherland. And there's such poignant and vivid images. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the karahi and why it was important for you to share that example in your essay.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if I had a different, if I could have done a second curatorial shaping of the book, it would have been around the objects that we carried. Because for me, it's the pot I'll talk about. For Keisha, it's the clothing. Michelle Joan Wilkinson writes a beautiful essay on the jewelry. That was passed down to her, that she brought over. Our letters, and our family photographs that we don't have JPEGs of or double copies of, just the one yellowing originals. So many things that, you know, for us, are museum quality things that belong, you know, in museums because they're that valuable and such treasures to us. So, I write about this karahi pot, which my grandmother owned. And so we've been cooking in this pot for the last 50, 60 years. And it's this karahi is a very typical pot that most Guyanese households have, and it's influenced from the history of Indian indentureship in the Caribbean. And so my grandmother cooked for my mom and her siblings in this pot. My mom cooked for us in this pot. Out of all the things on the night that we were leaving, that we decided to stuff the suitcases with, this 50-year-old pot had to come. And now it's with my mom's house, and my sister and I are jockeying over who gets this pot, who gets to inherit this pot. It has no monetary value, but it's an example of that very liminal moment when we're leaving, of how we attach value to the things that we're going to carry from the old into the new, and the things that we are going to leave. And I would venture to say that if we were to do a whole book on everyone, not just Guyanese people, but almost everyone's migration stories, and that moment of deciding, you know, are we going to take the clock? Are we going to take this big pot? It's a huge pot that was bulging in the suitcase. I was in a book club. The book was part of a book club, and an Italian woman was talking about almost a machete that she was trying to sneak into, because she comes from a family of cooks and chefs. And so this Italian immigrant family were trying to figure out how to sneak a machete into the suitcase without getting arrested at TSA. But the idea, this notion of the things that we carry across borders, and what we also write about in Liminal Spaces as women, is as daughters, our mothers' things that we have to carry across borders. And that also is a heavy responsibility of deciding, you know, our mothers and our grandmothers' things that belong to be on the journey with us.
Absolutely. And you tell that story so beautifully of your mother trying to fit the karahi in the suitcase, and, you know, what would have to be removed from the suitcase to have the karahi make the journey. I was really...
Did you have to make those decisions when you left your grandmother's things, that you had to choose and decide what to bring?
You know, I don't remember what was left. I remember what I brought with me on the plane. My grandmother, I'd received in those shipments back home a doll that my aunt had sent for me for Christmas one year. And so my grandmother had sewn me a dress for the trip and sewn a matching dress for my doll. And so for many, many years, my mother kept that dress. It was just the exact, you know, replicate of my dress in a miniature form for my doll. And so that was just an odd thing for me to have that kind of has stayed with me for a long time, you know. So those are the things that I remember. But, you know, while we're talking about your essay, because I really found your essay to be so moving, Grace, it's so beautifully written and it's so powerful. And it resonated so much with my own memories of who I left behind. So you tell the story of your best friend from when you left when you were 14 years old and being reunited with her when you got back to Guyana. and you thinking about how your life would have been different had you not left, and seeing how different her life was. I've had so many of those conversations. You know, I've had conversations like that with cousins of mine where we've explicitly talked about, you know, why they didn't leave Guyana and how their lives were different. And then others who it's not explicit in the conversation, but it's implicit. It's sort of the thing that's not spoken about. And I realize that we who have left oftentimes suffer from a form of survivor's guilt because we, you know, were able to go on and get an education and build careers. And it's not to say that people in Guyana aren't doing those things too, but they don't have the same access to those things. And oftentimes, you know, all of those troubling statistics about Guyana, about alcoholism, depression, mental health issues, poverty, the people who are left behind are suffering with all of those issues. And we have to confront them when we reunite with those folks.
It's a hard thing, and it's a hard thing to sit and grapple about with, because you have to really own up to the ways in which you failed. You failed the people you love. And so for me, it was survivor's guilt, but it was also about failure and reconciling with that failure. And the only difference between those of us who got to leave and those of us who didn't was somebody got on a plane and somebody didn't, right? There's no other requirements of eligibility other than you have a plane ticket and a visa and someone doesn't. And I returned to Guyana after many years and returned with all of these expectations, Anika. I mean, up to the wazoo about what this beautiful, romantic, almost kind of a lover's reunion, you know, I think that's what I had, the story I was imagining in my head of what this romantic reunion would be. And it was such a mirror to my face of, you didn't really grapple with the lives that were left here. And you cannot show up to the place and expect the reunion to be seamless and like nothing's happened and all of these years hadn't passed. And you can't expect that person either to not want to hold you accountable for leaving.
Yeah.
All of that you have to confront. And I'm still struggling with that. That was a really hard essay for me to even decide on if I wanted to make that public. You know, the book, I'm really proud of the contributors in the book. I talked about Maria del Pilar Caledine. And so the book has memoir in it, memoir essays in it, as much as it has, you know, creative pieces and artistic pieces. So we had a privacy issue to grapple with here, because we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about our families' lives. We're talking about big people's stories. We're talking about personal, private, secret things. And I remember one of the contributor had taken out something that she didn't want published. By the time we were ready for publication, that person had passed on. And so she reached out and said, listen, now that the person's passed on, I think I will be okay in not being offensive or hurtful to this person. So let's put this part, you know, back in. All of these things we had to grapple with. And, you know, that particular part of being accountable to the people that we left, of saying whatever forms of apologies we need to say, even if we feel we don't need to say it, of not staying in touch enough, of not staying in touch at all, of forgetting, of erasing, of not doing enough to be helpful. All of that, this book really tries to grapple with my own chapter and the other chapters as well. And it's a really hard thing to do, but I'm really proud of all of us in the book in being brave enough and courageous enough to hold ourselves accountable in that part of the migration arc.
Absolutely. And the part of that accountability is telling these stories. Yes, in the telling, we have to grapple with those issues of privacy and maintaining the dignity of people who are left behind and sharing such intimate details. But I can see in your essay and across all of these works that all of these contributors are telling these stories as a way to come to terms with having left, and as a way of saying, I haven't forgotten, right? And that's part of why it's so powerful. So, we've been talking about intermittently here about Keisha Scarvo's Mama's Clothes series, which, are so dear to me. I first learned about Scarvo's work when you did that visually speaking conversation at the Schomburg, and I saw her photographs there for the first time. I was really struck in the book by how Mama's Clothes tells the story of displacement from two homelands, right? So there's the immediate homeland of Guyana, from which she's displaced, but there's a more distant homeland of Africa. And so when Scarvo chooses the bright colors from her mother's wardrobe, she says she's attracted to these garments, that particularly the ones that have bright colors. And she does the self-portraits where you can't see her face, but you can see the clothing in many of them. There's an implicit connection to, an explicit rather, connection to Guyana and her mother, a mother and a motherland. But I think there's an implicit connection to Africa as well. In the brown bodies in Scarvo's images, and in the footnote to the Kaiser News article about the place in Guyana where her mother was born, which is described as Buxton, rich in African cultures. So the book really tells that story of the two homelands, and it's not just the homelands of Africa and Guyana, but also of India and Guyana too, right? And so this is one of the really, I think, interesting readings of Scarvo's work, is that we can see that connection to her mother, to Guyana, and then to Africa as a more broader kind of homeland. But because you can't see faces in her photographs, you can only see brown bodies. And because those prints also, to me, evoke India, there's a kind of blurring of ethnicity that's going on in her photographs, where it could also be a connection to India. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, and we could even take it into Natalie Hopkinson's essays with her mother as well. But that kind of Africa-India connection to the broader Guyanese story and how that comes across in various essays.
And in addition to, the African heritage and Indian heritages of Guyana, of course, there's, our indigenous folks who we call Amerindian, for those of you watching. We engage, some of the contributors engage their Chinese history as well in the book. A lot of Guyanese people are actually mixed with an assortment of multiple heritages and multiple backgrounds. I like the word blurring that you use, Anika. I like it a lot, because I think that we were very intentional in ensuring that this project featured all of the faces of Guyana without actually stating we are featuring all of the faces of Guyana, because to live there and to grow up there and to be from there, that kind of multiculturalism is our norm. And I remember coming to the United States and really encountering what race and racism was for the first time, not in my 14 years of growing up in Guyana, but as an immigrant in the United States. And it floored me. I had nothing, believe it or not, I had nothing in Guyana that prepared me for how race and racism was treated in this country, because a family of mixed African, Indian, Chinese, Amerindian people was the norm in my home, in my own family, in my community, on my block, my church, in my school. And so that intentionality in the book, when you look at the art, when you look at the family photographs, when you look at Keisha's work, Erica's work, Natalie Hopkinson's mother, Serena Hopkinson, talks about her Black and Indigenous heritage really beautifully, is to make that case that to be Guyanese is to come with this multiplicity of identities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, you're absolutely right that so many of us Guyanese are racially mixed, and that blurring of ethnicities is something that we experience from within our families. In Natalie and Serena Hopkinson's essays, we see that there are also cleavages between Guyanese of African and Indian descent, right? And so, Serena Hopkinson writes, because I looked ambiguous, I was brown-skinned but wore my soft curl straight. I didn't know whether I would be attacked in the streets by Indians or Africans. And she's talking about those moments of great racial upheaval in Guyana, in which there were violent riots. We know that part of Guyana's history is one in which, during the period of British colonialism, Africans and Indians were pitted against each other. And so, Africans came to Guyana before Indians as enslaved labor. After slavery was abolished, Indians were brought as indentured laborers and worked for a period of time before kind of quote unquote earning their freedom, although they were still tethered to the plantation in all kinds of complex ways. But from that early period in which Africans were free people, Indians newly freed people, and Indians were indentured laborers, the British pitted those two groups against each other. And part of the contemporary story of Guyana that gets told again and again is conflict, one of ethnic conflict between those two groups. We can't say that ethnic conflict does not exist because, stories like Serena Hopkinson's tell us that it does exist in a palpable way, even for mixed people, where she felt like she didn't know which group would attack her. But we know also that there were these intimacies between those groups that gets left out of that narrative, right? And so you're telling the story from your perspective where you didn't feel that when you were growing up. This is a really complex story, the story of ethnicity in Guyana, and it's one that's absolutely diverse, to include Amerindians, to include Chinese, to include Portuguese as well. But those two groups, the groups that populate the country the most, right? The largest groups, Africans and Indians. And that complex relationship gets brushed over as one of ethnic conflict. And I think that the intimacies are often left out of the picture. And so I think the book does this great job of alerting us to those intimate connections, even when they're troubling and painful.
Well, to be quite blunt, your existence and my existence is proof of the of the intimacies and the love between these two groups. I get, to be quite honest with you, I get I have a lot of anxiety when I'm doing these public talks, because what I've noticed is, and I'm going to pretend that there are a bunch of people watching, but what I've noticed is this almost default whenever you talk about Guyana, not just with my book, but if you ever publicly are having a conversation about Guyana, there's this default to interrogate people. Well, what about the racism, and what about the racial conflict? And that's why I quote Chimamanda Adichie's story, her TED Talk in the book, where she talks about, listen, we've all got to be careful in every single place, not just Guyana, about this notion of a dangerous single story. And she says that it's not that these stereotypes of places are untrue. Some of them are quite true, but it's that they're incomplete. And so we have to do the job of countering the dominant narratives, particularly if those dominant narratives are quite damaging. And that has been one of the most dominant, damaging narratives about Guyana is racial conflict between Africans and Indians. I don't think we're saying it's untrue or that it doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist at the level at which it exists. I think what we are trying to do, your brilliant scholarship, the work of the artists in this book, is to also counter that narrative with these additional stories that show that there are ways in which these people have been loving each other for decades and creating families and creating institutions and building this country up because of those intimacies and that love. And those stories warrant just as much attention as the opposite stories that are the ones making the headlines. And for the folks watching, I quoted Professor LeBennett in a tweet where she called out the New York Times for perpetrating these dangerous single stories. It's an article that started out with, oh, in the backwaters of Guyana, where the children are naked and running around the countryside. And you rightfully so call them out for that kind of one-dimensional, dangerous single story of a place. And I was so happy to see you do that.
Yeah, you know, this is a critical moment for Guyana. Your book arrives at a critical moment, and this is why I'm writing about Guyana now myself. That New York Times article was about the ExxonMobil oil discovery. Guyana is poised to move from being one of the poorest countries in the region to becoming one of the wealthiest countries in the region. So as the region's newest kind of petrostate, there's a new focus on Guyana. You know, it's long been marginalized in global discourses, even in discourses of the Caribbean. And that New York Times article was basically arguing that, okay, here's a place that's about to become very wealthy. What's going on there, and what are its chances for success? And one of the things that it points to in terms of why Guyana may not be able to handle this oil wealth is that narrative of ethnic conflict, right? And so we know that Guyana went through this very turbulent elections recently. It's a repeating narrative in Guyana, right? It's looked at as a place that in which Africans and Indians vie for political power. And the New York Times article was saying, you know, whoever kind of wins out in this latest election will be the group that will benefit the most from the oil wealth, whether the the new government will be Indian or African. That story is, yes, true, but it's also, as you say, more complicated because in Guyana, we have the understanding that nobody wins an election, right? Whether the candidate is of African descent or of Indian descent, nobody wins because there is such rampant corruption. So I wanted to speak out about that New York Times article because I felt that with new eyes on Guyana, in relation to this oil wealth, we're at a moment where we can intervene and correct these representations, which will proliferate. There will be more attention on Guyana as that oil money kind of, comes to fruition. And so this is the moment where Guyanese scholars, Guyanese artists need to really have their voices heard and paint a more complex picture so that those reductive narratives do not become the dominant narratives. And of course, that's what your book is doing as well.
And your book will also, everyone watching, Anika's future book will also be such an important piece of scholarship on this. I wonder, Anika, how do you think when that happens, and if that happens, this new boom in Guyana, and I say when and if quite intentionally, how it will impact what we're talking about here, how it will impact migration from and to the country?
I think it will impact migration in all kinds of ways. Your book ends with the reverse migration story. And I think that if that wealth comes to Guyana, there will be people who will want to go back. So my own mother is now retired and she divides her time between the US and Guyana. She has a house back home in Guyana. So she's already kind of done her reverse migration thing. But I think that other Guyanese who are abroad will feel compelled, and there are already stories being written about this, to go back home, to start a business, to own some land, right? To be a part of that kind of booming economy that we think could could occur. So there could be some changes, some shifts in terms of migration, I think, in terms of more reverse migration. I think that's part of one of the things that could happen. What do you think?
I honestly don't know. I think I don't know. I think what's happening to Guyana, if and when this oil boom comes to fruition, is so unprecedented. And unfortunately, if we look at other places as models, if we look at Venezuela, if we look at Trinidad, if we look at places like Nigeria, the prognosis isn't good in terms of what it will do to this country, its sense of community, its sense of solidarity. I honestly don't know. When a couple of years before the pandemic, I was there and I was on a panel and we were having this very heated, not me, but I was sitting there as panelists, were having this very heated conversation about how do we help the people that are poor and struggling in Guyana with this oil boom? Does the government just write them checks? And there were people that were very adamantly against that, and people that were adamantly in support of that. And what was interesting that came up about that conversation was this idea of deservingness. Well, does Guyana's poor deserve a check from the government? And it's a conversation that really, really broke my heart, that we were talking about people that were in dire need. And my family grew up, I think I took that very sensitively because my family grew up poor in Guyana. My mother's family grew up very poor in Guyana, and so did my father's family. So I come from that legacy of vulnerability when it comes to a lower economic class in Guyana. And so to see that hierarchy already splitting Guyanese apart in terms of, well, do the poor deserve a check versus do we just move on and forget these folks? It's not encouraging. And I say I don't know because I'm actually more fearful of what the boom will do for the people that are there than I am hopeful. And I may get into a lot of flack for saying that, but.
Well, everything you're saying, Grace, is part of it is the story of capitalism, right? So we know that the poor tend to not benefit from these massive forms of wealth in any nations that have that kind of stark divide in terms of, the haves and the have-nots. I think that you're pointing to the very fears that I have too. And I want to pause and first of all say that I so appreciate what you're saying about your family's story, because it's my story too, and it's oftentimes not discussed in academic channels, right? So we learn and we speak and work in these privileged spaces, these Ivy League spaces. But my family was very poor as well. My mother's family was incredibly poor. And these are the people who raised me, rural, poor Guyanese. And so, yeah, I think that has shaped my perspective as a scholar, but it's not something that I speak about usually in academic spaces. So I want to acknowledge your bravery and why it's important to say that and to name that, because when we speak to our students, we know that they come from these backgrounds too, right? And they're always, they're gravitating to faculty who can kind of understand their stories. So if you and I can understand those stories, albeit from a Guyanese perspective, I think that resonates with our students, the people we're teaching. But the other part of what you said that's important to me is that Guyanese themselves are having conversations about what this oil wealth will mean. And that was part of my criticism of the New York Times article. It was painting Guyanese as sort of being uncivilized, informed, backwards, not connected to the global world around them, when in fact, the article itself shows, there's a story of one woman who's a seamstress, has a business, and she says, look at what happened with oil in Trinidad. We don't want that to happen here. Guyanese are really connected to the world around them. Everyone in Guyana reads the newspaper every day, right? And so we know we know what this oil money can mean, and all of those hard conversations about who will get the benefits of this are being had in Guyana. And so it's not to say that I'm not nervous about government corruption and whether or not poor people will have access to that wealth, but I do want to emphasize that Guyanese are acutely aware of this themselves. They're not kind of looking at this starry-eyed, and they're not uninformed. And that was what I found troubling about the representation in the New York Times.
And there's a preponderance of that too, an outsider media machine descending on Guyana for a week, writing the story, publishing the story, and then leaving, right? Yeah. So the media's role in this is also quite something that we need to call attention to and have conversations about. Yeah. I think I think this is the point where we go to Q&A, but I'm seeing mostly lovely comments and confirmations of, yes, that's so true. So I can scroll through the Q&A, and we can also continue chatting if Allison Hamilton is really finding what both of us are saying, really resonating with her own story. But I'm not seeing any actual questions. So if we want to continue, we can.
Okay. Yeah.
Onika, would it be prudent for you to share a little bit about your next project? Because I think that is so incredibly important, that work that is coming.
Mm-hmm, sure. So I'm currently calling the book Global Guyana, Women, Race, and Resources in the Caribbean and Beyond. And it takes the new attention to Guyana around this oil wealth as sort of a jumping off point to say that Guyana is an important place from which we can look out into global processes. And I tell that story of Guyana's connection to global processes through the context of my own family. So part of the book is autoethnographic. In the first chapter, I begin with my great-great-grandparents. And so as you mentioned before, I come from a racially mixed Guyanese family. My father was of African descent. My mother is of Indian descent. And my whole life, I thought of myself as somebody who was Indian and Black because my father was Black and my mother is Indian. I learned, however, that on my Indian side, there had been intermarriage, African Indian intermarriage, way back. So my first maternal relative who came to Guyana was my great-great-grandmother, who came to Guyana when she was 21 years old and had a child with an African man at a time when that relationship was strictly tabooed. It really was not permissible under British colonial rule for Africans and Indians to intermarry, to have children together. But there in the birth records, I saw that my great-great-grandfather on the Indian side was of African descent. And so I look at that as one of those early moments in which Guyanese people were breaking those taboos, were defying those rules of social conduct. And I look at the ways in which Blackness gets obscured on my mother's side. So why was that not part of the story that I knew growing up? I always was told that my great-grandparents were Indian and they came from India as indentured servants. Not entirely true, right? So I look at that sort of marginalizing of Blackness on my mother's side and really grapple with it. And I had all of those tough decisions to make, Grace, about what to share, what's private, right? Whose privileges, whose secrets am I sharing here? I use primarily archival research and oral histories with my mother and with her oldest sister to tell that story. But the other chapters of the book look at Guyana's global connections and women's role in those global connections in all kinds of ways. So the second chapter is about the relationship between Guyana and Barbados. And I tell that story largely through the lens of Rihanna. So everybody knows Rihanna as a Bajan superstar, but many people don't know that her mother was Guyanese. And so I look at the long history of close kinship ties between Bajans and Barbadians. a long history of migration between the two places. And if you kind of scratch the surface of any family tree in Barbados, you probably will find a Guyanese 1 or 2 generations back. And so I tell that complex story through kind of historical and contemporary examples. And the other 2 chapters of the book deal with resources, oil and sand. Those are the 2 resources that I think are kind of the Janus face of what's going on in Guyana. So the oil story is a really big story and everyone's paying attention to it, but sand is a lesser known story. Guyanese sand is being shipped out all over the Caribbean to replenish beaches in places like Jamaica, St. Vincent, Grenada, the Grenadines, all of those places that have bustling tourism economies. Guyana does not. We're not known for our sandy beaches, but we do have this bounty of quartz silica sand that is a hot commodity right now. So I look at where sand is going and the ways in which Guyana gets erased, literally, quite literally, because Guyana is being carted off and shipped away. But also when you're a tourist relaxing on those beaches in one of those other places, you don't know that you're lying on Guyanese sand. So that's what the book is doing. There's so many overlaps between your project and mine, Grace. I don't have that element of visual art there, but the struggles with how to tell the story that's so personal, that's so intimately connected to who I am is, of course, one of the challenges of that project. Thanks for asking so I could share about it.
I'm asking because I also can't wait to be in conversation about it with you. We have a question from Sandra, and I think this is a question fitting for both of our scholarship and our work, and that is, how are we viewing the challenges of gender versus race, or gender and race in Guyana? And so Sandra, I'll tell you that to do this book on migration and women is largely also a book about migration data, because not only for the first time are there more women migrating than men universally. Okay, so this is a universal movement. But since the 1950s, 1960s, Caribbean women, including Guyanese women, have largely been migrating more than men out of the country. And that's because more women are becoming heads of their households. More women are financially, economically responsible for their families, for getting jobs and taking care of their families. And there was a moment, particularly within United States migration history, where there was, and Canada too, I believe, where there was this incredible need for blue collar workers, for home care aides, for hospitality workers, for nurses, for restaurant workers, for hotel workers. And Caribbean women were filling that labor need. And so you had this incredible movement of Caribbean women largely doing the migrating. And then, of course, sending back to bring their entire families, which is a situation very personal to you, Onika, sending back to then bring their entire families with them. And during the last administration here in the United States, there was an article that showed how Guyanese families in particular were at great risk because there was going to be a new policy that would severely curtail family sponsorship visas. And Guyanese women were largely utilizing family sponsorship visas to bring their families over to the United States. And so it would have impacted their work to bring families together severely. So gender is a huge, huge part of our migration stories, hence this book. And Onika, you've been doing incredible work with young girls in Brooklyn and the Caribbean in your past book project.
Yeah. I mean, I echo everything you just said. Women and children bear the brunt of the challenges attached to migration in significant ways. So, not only is it women who are increasingly heads of households and kind of leading the, the charge on recent migration from places like Guyana, but it's their children who are also disproportionately affected by family separation and those issues. So if we're looking at migration and if we're looking at family, we have to think about gender. We have to think about children in particular. I also think that in popular representation, women and girls tend to bear the brunt of kind of objectifying and reductive representations. And so, I think about recent representations of Guyanese in popular media, and it seems like I'm seeing a whole new crop of these, whether it's in, a recent episode of the HBO series Lovecraft or in Indian matchmaking on Netflix. We're seeing Guyanese women represented, I think, for the first time in these interesting but troubling ways, right? And so part of the story of global inequalities and the sort of global South narratives that shape the story of migration is this marginalization of women and this objectification of women that I've tried to stress and emphasize in my work.
Yeah, I've been watching the emergence of Guyanese women in popular culture. There's a whole PhD dissertation waiting to be written, not mine, someone else's dissertation waiting to be written about that. In the Q&A, I'm so heartened to see, Onika, there are a lot of Guyanese people based in the UAE, and they're saying hello and hi back. It's so lovely to know that you're all there. I'm in New York and Onika is zooming in from California. So we're saying hello to you all. There's a question that asks, I would love to hear your response on this too. How have your notions of home transmutated over time, and your notions of identity and belonging too? I'll let you start with that because that's a real heavy one.
That is a heavy one. So at this point, I've lived in the US for far longer than I lived in Guyana, right? I left Guyana when I was 7.5 years old. I'm quite a bit older than that now. And what's interesting to me is, of course, I'm, a scholar who's based in the US, and I'm somebody who identifies as African American. But I always think of Guyana as home. When I think about home, it's Guyana. And I returned to Guyana repeatedly during my childhood. Every summer I went home and stayed with my grandmother. When I wasn't in Guyana in the summertime, I was with Guyanese relatives in Toronto. And so I was always immersed in Guyanese communities, whether in Brooklyn, whether in Guyana itself, or whether in Scarborough, Ontario, outside of Toronto. So Guyana is home to me. And for that reason, it continues to sort of shape my perspectives and all of my experiences. I think that way of looking at the world as a kind of outsider. So, and many Caribbean scholars had this perspective. Stuart Hall, one of my heroes, was able to marshal that in really brilliant ways. But Guyana is this unique place because we're culturally Caribbean, but we're geographically South American, the only English-speaking country in South America. We're this really kind of outside child of the Caribbean. I think that's really shaped who I am. It's such a large part of who I am. So yeah, my answer is Guyana remains home to me.
A really interesting thing happens to me when I'm away from Guyana and outside of Guyana. I echo exactly what you just shared, that Guyana is home. When I'm in Guyana, I feel very much like a foreigner in Guyana. And the fact that I've lived outside of Guyana and left Guyana becomes even more acute when I'm in Guyana. And that just keeps shape-shifting all of the time. I will say this, and I was sharing this with you and Anne earlier before we went live, that the long-term rupturing and fracturing that migration enacts on our lives, I think is something that we will spend a lifetime trying to understand. And I think it's okay to be upfront about that, that our notions of home is something for those of us who have migrated, whether by choice or trauma or force, that we will spend a lifetime trying to understand and negotiate this very question that's being asked: what is home? And who are you? And who are you at this point of your life? And who are you in this particular part of the world? And one of the things that I want to continue to do with my work as open and honest as I can is continue to really examine those long-term fractures and fissures and rupturing that migration has in our lives. And I think there are ways in which that those fault lines show up in very overt ways. And then there are moments where it comes decades later and in very, very subtle ways, but still emotionally tormenting ways. And that work of trying to unpack that, whether creatively or through scholarship or through photography, is what we attempted to do with this first iteration of this project, and what we will hope to continue to do. But I think it's such an important question, and I think it's a lifelong struggle to grapple with that question. We have one more question, and it's also a really good, hard one, and I think we'll end with that. It's from Nadia Hussein, and she's a first-generation Guyanese, born and raised in the US, and she's currently a senior at NYU Abu Dhabi. Yay, congratulations, almost done. Good for you. And her question is, can we speak about the colonial legacy as it relates to our work? And how does the colonial history of Guyana affect or present itself in our stories, specifically as it relates to women and family structures? And you touched on this beautifully too in your question, Onika, about this idea of leaving the distant motherland, meaning India or Africa. And that's why we named the first part of the book Mothering Lands. And Mothering Lands is meant to, of course, engage Guyana, but engage the lands that we all come from before Guyana: China, India, Portugal, Africa. Yes, so the colonial histories, how it impacts our work, and how those colonial histories show up in our work.
Well, you know, it shows up in many ways, what I was talking about earlier in terms of that early moment of racial mixture in my own family, when my great-grandparents kind of defied the colonial taboos of the time. So certainly my own family story has that colonial kind of legacy attached to it. But I think that, you know, for my scholarship and for my current project, one of the ways in which the colonial narrative continues to shape Guyana's prospects for the future is the narrative of discovery. Part of that New York Times article that we talked about earlier is sort of placing Guyana as this sort of uncharted territory. And, you know, Gordon Ramsay has a series called Uncharted, which recently had an episode in Guyana in which it kind of resuscitated all of those colonial era narratives of sort of a white colonial intrepid and explorer going to Guyana and discovering, you know, Amerindian food deep in the jungles. We see that narrative of discovery and the kind of contemporary articulation of the myth of El Dorado coming up again and again around oil, right? So people are sort of discovering Guyana for the first time. ExxonMobil struck oil, discovered oil there. It's the new El Dorado all over again. What's troubling about that myth is it objectifies the Guyanese people. It places Guyana as a site for consumption from the outside, right? It doesn't allow Guyana to sort of control its own destiny. It's just an object to be seen and to be discovered and taken. So I think that we see those remnants of the colonial era, you know, in the stories about Guyana. I mean, I could go on and speak more broadly about, you know, quote unquote underdevelopment and why Guyana is sort of in the dire straits it's in right now. It's a story that's true of former colonies across the globe. So, you know, absolutely that colonial legacy continues to shape the realities of Guyanese people and my own scholarship.
You know, Anika, I remember I went to Queens College, and I remember even before Queens College in primary school and things, I remember, you know, opening these textbooks and seeing, you know, British colonial language and stamped in between the covers, and, you know, the Queen stamps of approval essentially in these books. And I learned about the history of African enslavement and Indian indentureship and Chinese indentureship as chronology. You know, it's one little paragraph in the British textbook that said, and slavery was abolished. It was almost wrote, and slavery was abolished in 1838, and then came the Indians, and then came the Chinese, and that was it. That was all you got. And so I also remember growing up in you know, my childhood in Guyana, growing up with a lot of women and within my own families, my friends' families, that couldn't read or write. And so there was this culture of literacy that was also normal for me when it came specifically to the women that I grew up around. And so for us to come together from Guyana, from Canada, from the United States, from the UK, and author as women, as women of all these multiple heritages, as you, Anika, to come. We're just one generation removed from our parents and two generations removed from our grandmothers. These were their realities, a culture of illiteracy, a culture of misinformation or lack of information about their histories, and a culture of poverty, right? These are just one generation's removed. And here we are, authoring our own stories, right? These are stories about us and by us and for us. And for me, that is a direct countering of that colonial legacy. And it's one of my students called this book a radical act of literacy. And I thought that was so incredibly generous and thoughtful. And when I thought about my own history of, you know, my people in my family, aunts that couldn't read or write, and here is their niece, you know, with gathering women to author and write our own stories. I think it's a profound statement. The work that you're doing, both in your own authorship and the young women that you allow to tell their stories too in your work, that's also us countering that colonial legacy. We have to go. We're going to save these questions, but I do want to tell you that one of your former students says hello. Ariane Sinot is in the Q&A. And
oh, so, lovely. Hello.
She shared some beautiful, beautiful, lovely, kind thoughts about our conversation with each other. And I'm going to put the link in the chat for the book one more time, and for everyone who maybe came later. And also as a final thought, say to my friend and brilliant scholar, Anika, thank you so, this was so wonderful. And let me reiterate what I said earlier, that the work that you're doing for our country and for the women of Guyana is so incredibly important and so brilliant and so innovative and so dynamic. And I will continue to champion you the way that you have always championed me and showed me in this work great generosity. So thank you, Anika.
Thank you so much, Grace. This was such a wonderful opportunity for me. I feel so lucky to be able to have this conversation with you. And of course, so happy to have you as a friend, but everything I said about why this work is so important is so at the forefront of my mind as I look at this book. It's really, you called it a labor of love. I know it was that for you. I know how hard the process of editing is, and to bring together this multimodal kind of approach to understanding women and art in the diaspora is a monumental achievement. And so I can't emphasize enough what a valuable contribution this is and how lucky we all are that you brought this book into the world. Thank you so much, Grace. And thank you for letting me be a part of this conversation. So much fun.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for watching us. Good night wherever you are. Good morning to wherever you are. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.